Hey guys, in this video, we're going to be talking about estrogen and alcohol, which alcoholic beverages contain the most estrogens and the least estrogens, and some tips you can do to mitigate the estrogenic or toxic effects of alcohol consumption. So if you're familiar with our YouTube channel, then you've likely heard me talk about this topic before. I've answered it in an FAQ recently, and I've mentioned it throughout various videos where I give tips on how to reduce your estrogenic load. However, I decided to make this a standalone video for anybody who's maybe missed this information in the past, or if you're new to our YouTube channel and you're interested in this topic. I think it's a really important thing to understand because alcohol consumption is very common, and estrogen exposure is also very common, and it's a major cause for a lot of people's health issues. If you're unfamiliar with estrogen dominance, where estrogen is dominating the protective hormone progesterone, then you're well aware of the very negative effects that elevated levels of estrogen can have on your body. It can contribute to PCOS, prostate issues, breast and prostate cancer, hair loss, hypothyroidism, weight gain, depression, fatigue. Really, most health problems have underlying hormonal imbalances, usually driven by hormones like estrogen, since the hormones are what are dictating most of the physiological processes that occur in the body. So getting a handle on your estrogen levels is going to be key for correcting these conditions and a lot of other health issues that I didn't mention. And one of the simplest ways to really get a handle on your estrogen levels is to take a look at what you're consuming on a regular basis. And this is because foods and beverages, particularly alcohol, do have estrogens in them. And one of the most estrogenic things that you could consume next to xenoestrogen-rich medications and plastics and commercial products is, of course, alcohol. Now, in the past, people have asked, does all alcohol contain estrogen, or is it only beer because beer has hops, which for those of you who do not know is a phytoestrogen? And the answer to this question is yes. Actually, all alcoholic beverages are going to be estrogenic. So this is the first thing to understand, is that any type of alcoholic beverage is estrogenic, and this is for a simple reason. The bacteria or yeast that produce alcohol, that eat the sugar in an alcoholic beverage, so whether that's wine, whether that's a hard liquor or distilled liquor, whether that's some sort of beer or some sort of other alcoholic beverage, what happens in order to make this alcoholic beverage is that usually a combination of some sort of water and sugar is combined with some form of yeast, alcohol producing yeast. And these yeast eat up the sugars in the liquid, and they produce not just alcohol, but they also produce reproductive estradiol, so that way they can proliferate and reproduce. So in this way, any sort of alcoholic beverage, even the ones that don't contain hops or other phytoestrogens, are actually going to be estrogenic because the yeast that make alcohol produce their own reproductive estrogen. So that means wine, even liquors, other sort of distilled spirits are all actually going to be estrogenic. It's not just the beer. But with that being said, there are certain alcoholic beverages that are more estrogenic than others. So I sort of already gave it away, but the most estrogenic alcoholic beverage that you could consume would be a very hoppy beer, and maybe a beer that contains not just hops, but maybe even cannabis or CBD. I'm sure that's out there now on the market. And this is because not only does the yeast that produce beer produce their own estrogen, but the base of most beers are usually grain-based, which are phytoestrogenic, and hops-based, which is very phytoestrogenic herb. And if you're adding something like CBD or cannabis, cannabis comes from the hops family and is also estrogenic. So probably the most estrogenic alcoholic beverage you could ever consume would be something that's a double hops beer that maybe contains another phytoestrogenic herb in it, like cannabis. So generally speaking, very hoppy beer is going to be the most estrogenic alcoholic beverage you could consume, which is why people that consume a lot of beer often get that beer gut, because they're really slowing down their metabolism. They're going to gain more weight, particularly around the stomach region, which is usually indicating high cortisol levels. And estrogen stimulates cortisol. So this is usually why I think you get that beer belly, because of how estrogenic beer is. That's just one reason. It could also be because, most grains and most estrogens can inflame the body, so maybe there's some intestinal inflammation occurring as well, and maybe there's an allergenic response to the grains and corn and things used to make very estrogen-rich beers. So Beer is going to be the one you really want to avoid if you're worried about your estrogen levels. And beyond that, wine is probably going to be the second most estrogenic because grape skins can have an estrogenic or phytoestrogenic property, but also in wine, there's a certain level of histamine that is being produced, and histamine can actually stimulate the further production of estrogen. So this makes wine very estrogenic as well because the potential phytoestrogenic effects of the grapes, the estrogens from the yeast that make the alcohol in wine, and also the histamine that can stimulate the further production of estrogen. Beyond this point, all of your liquors are going to also be estrogenic for the basic reason we discussed here, but the least estrogenic of your liquors are going to be the cleared, hard distilled liquors. So things like vodka and tequila and maybe even gin are going to be your least estrogenic alcoholic beverage, whereas your darker liqueurs, although they might have higher levels of antioxidants, they're more likely to be estrogenic than the clear stuff. So in general, I think in terms of trying to reduce your estrogenic exposure through the consumption of alcohol, you're going to want to avoid your beers, avoid the wines, and if you are going to drink alcohol, stick to clear distilled alcohol. And my other tip would be that when you consume these things, try to have it with something like orange juice. So I think screwdriver, I think is what it's called. A combination of something like potato vodka with fresh squeezed orange juice could be a safe route to go because fresh squeezed orange juice does contain naringin, which is a flavonoid that has an anti-aromatase or anti-estrogen effect. So combining that might be very beneficial to mitigate some of the estrogenic effects of that alcohol. In addition to that, I would recommend that, generally speaking, if you're consuming alcohol because it's just something you enjoy and you don't want to give it up, that you're also taking proactive steps to reduce your estrogen exposure elsewhere. So something that might be very beneficial if you're an alcoholic beverage consumer is that you're utilizing anti-aromatase and anti-estrogen herbs like nettle root, like milk thistle, like pine pollen, and other anti-aromatase foods. So foods that are rich in zinc are going to have an anti-aromatase or anti-estrogen effect. Foods that are generally going to promote the health of the thyroid. So all the foods that we talk about in the Perfect Thyroid course are going to help to oppose estrogen because the thyroid hormone does regulate estrogen. So if you are consuming alcohol, keep in mind it is a stress. It is a source of estrogen. But if you're keeping it, moderate and minimal, and you're focusing on a more or less anti-estrogen or low stress diet and lifestyle, then the effects of, a drink here and there from something like the potato vodka and fresh orange juice isn't going to be as damaging as it would if you're consuming tons of it or tons of beer and wine, and also consuming tons of other estrogen-rich foods. So in addition to these tips, I'm also going to recommend that you check out this video here, which dives into the various nutrients that are actually depleted in the liver through consuming alcohol. So things like riboflavin, things like magnesium, B vitamins, all of these things are generally depleted by the consumption of alcohol, which damages the liver, impairs the production of ATP in the liver, which is usually how alcohol actually damages the liver in the first place. So the theory is that replacing the nutrients lost through the consumption of alcohol can help to protect your body and specifically your liver from the damaging effects of alcohol consumption. So we talk about all of this in that video, and it'd be very helpful to apply the information in addition to the information in this video if you're trying to mitigate some of the toxic or estrogenic effects of alcohol. However, that does bring this video to a close. If you've enjoyed it and found it helpful, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you haven't yet already. And if you're interested in learning more beyond this YouTube channel, keep in mind we do have an online wellness academy. We have a blog and an online tonic herb shop where you can find all of these anti-estrogen herbs we talked about. All this information you can find in the description box below.